Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Great Lakes Seminar Series. This morning, we're excited to bring to you a presentation, the Great Lakes Aquatic Habitat Framework, a spatial framework database and tools to meet the needs of Great Lakes management and research. My name is Margaret Lansing. I'm the Chief of Information Services here. For our remote participants, we've gotten some indication that you've got some echoing, and we're not quite sure what's going on. We've done everything we can on our end, so please bear with us. The background noise that you were hearing should be gone now as the audience quiets down. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Ed Rutherford, our speakers, research fisheries biologist here at the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. And please note that you can ask questions during the webinar, and also that we will post the recording afterwards in a day or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce Doctors Catherine Riseng and Kevin Wehrly. Catherine's from the University of Michigan, and Kevin is from Michigan's Department of Natural Resources Institute for Fisheries Research, where I was based for 14 years, down the hall from Kevin. And they're going to talk about some really exciting work that they're doing, developing habitat data and analysis for the Great Lakes. Both of them have been working on assessment of habitats for invertebrates and fish in Michigan lakes and streams, and now are focusing on the Great Lakes, doing a coastal assessment of fish habitat in the Great Lakes nearshore zone. Kevin has been working on an inland water atlas, which is a digital atlas that's really useful for managers and researchers. And hopefully, if he has time and afterwards, he can tell you more about it. There's a large group at Institute for Fisheries Research here today, developing databases and tools that feed all this. These guys are just the glory hounds. But the real work is done by those in the back of the room. What else shall I say? Oh, Catherine is a Great Lakes person as well. She works on the EPA cruises doing benthic macroinvertebrate surveys for several years. And I think I better shut up and let them talk, but it's a great pleasure to have them here.
And it's a great pleasure to be invited, and we're very honored to be able to present our work here at this seminar. So thank you very much. So I'm going to be starting out and giving the first half of the presentation, and then Kevin is going to start in the second half. I don't want to go any further, though, without acknowledging all of the people that have been contributing to this project over the 4 years that the project has been involved. We have a very active set of co-PIs on the project that represent experts from across the Great Lakes, looking at Great Lakes ecology, fisheries management, coastal ecosystems, remote sensing, and GIS expertise, and they've given us advice and input all along the project. We also have, as Ed alluded to, an incredible project staff that's mostly housed at the Institute of Fisheries Research, and they're all listed here. Many of them are here in the audience, and that staff is led by our chief GIS analyst, Lacey Mason. We also have a very large set of collaborators, and I'm afraid that I've missed some of them in this list, but from across the basin, from agencies, from NGOs that have been contributing, again, all of their input, their data, advice, and a number of them have been involved in some working groups that we have that have been working on some really technical issues. We're especially grateful to some of the people from the Canadian agencies that have been involved for a number of years, especially Mike Robertson and John Geo from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and Alice Stout from Environment Canada. So this is part of it as well. We just want to represent all of the agencies that have contributed to the project, both in data and intellectual contributions. So the outline that we're going to cover today is kind of simple. I'm going to talk first about sort of the context and goals for the project, as well as the framework itself and the data that, some examples of the data that are involved in the project. And then Kevin's going to pick up and talk about the tools and the classification framework that are part of the project. So sort of to think the context for developing this project is that we know that the Great Lakes is a very large, complex ecosystem with diverse habitats from embayments to high energy shorelines, from coastal, very diverse coastal forms, as well as variation in human development patterns across the Great Lakes. It also covers a really large geographic extent with a lot of large variation in climate, in geology, in terrestrial vegetation forms. And so we need to try to encompass all of these in one framework is the purpose that we're thinking, is what the GLAHF purpose. We also know that the management is also very complex, and it occurs from multiple agencies at federal, state, local, and NGOs, and that the management curves at multiple spatial scales, from basin-wide to lake-wide to local to even coastal segments. So managers and researchers have told us that they really need to have accessible, consistent, and comparable physical, chemical, and biological data for the region to be able to make these management decisions. Also, in the past couple of decades, GIS has really advanced to enable us to incorporate all these really multiple kinds of data, very complex data, into geodatabases and incorporate some sort of high-level programming that I know many of you work with. And so that is also enabling sort of a new resurgence of sort of GIS spatial databases. So think about some of the background and some of the spatial databases that have been developed that really have contributed to our project. We have the Great Lakes Monitoring Project, and that comes out of the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant and the US EPA, and they have been incorporating place-based monitoring data from the GLIMPO project, some USGS stream data. There's been some NOAA buoy data, some data from the Lake Erie Habitat Task Force, all in one geographic extent where it's site-based, where you can click on a site and find out what the data is. Similarly, the GLE 1 and 2 and the Great Lakes Wetland Consortium, they have a spatial database that includes site-based data for all these different coastal ecosystems that are then used to develop indicators. There's also the Great Lakes Environmental Management Project from Dave Allen at the University of Michigan, where he has assembled mostly stressor data for the open water and developed stress indices. There's also the Great Lakes Biodiversity Strategies led by the Nature Conservancies and the Michigan National Features Inventory. And they've assembled a number of different spatial databases and used those to then develop conservation strategies, but they're not really integrated into a consistent framework. There's also the Great Lakes Information Network under the Great Lakes Commission, where they provide a wide number of reference databases. And then there's the Great Lakes Observing System, where they have a portal to all kinds of sort of real-time and historical, mostly hydrological type of data. And then there's the Great Lakes GAP and the Great Lakes GIS. The Great Lakes GAP is led by Jim McKenna out of USGS, and the Great Lakes GIS from Ed Rutherford out of Noel Glural. And these two projects are quite similar to our project, where they have a spatial grid framework where they've attached habitat data with a focus on looking at parameters of fish habitat. And they really are sort of the forerunners of our project. We're sort of the next generation of both of these projects. And so that's our Great Lakes Aquatic Habitat Framework, or the GLAHF project. And I many of the people who have been involved in these other projects are either PIs or collaborators on our project and have contributed data. So we've been able to build on all of these other efforts to create a project that we think will help unify and provide a location for all the data from these projects that can be accessed in one place. So the goals for our project were to develop a consistent geographic framework that can be used to integrate all the data that you saw from the different projects and other data that's out there, to be able to track monitoring data over time, and to facilitate data sharing and integration across projects and across space and time. So we were another key goal was to then obtain, to process, and then to incorporate the data into the framework to make it very consistent binationally, so that the data is harmonized from across the US and the Canadian borders. So our initial focus was to get data that was available for both US and Canadian side, and we've started to diverge a little bit from that. Another key goal was that we work with these advisory groups and with collaborators to get their input so that the final product that we make is usable to all of these user groups and stakeholder groups. That's, I mean, was the key thing is that this is a framework that can be used and is useful. Another goal was that from the data that we have and from the framework, that we then want to develop an ecological based classification framework that Kevin's going to talk about, as well as provide public access and tools to be able to access that data, which Kevin is also going to talk about. So briefly, the spatial framework is a set of grid cells, like raster cells, that have been laid across the Great Lakes Basin, and they are, we show the point of origin there, that they're directly coincide with other big spatial databases like the DEM or the land use developed by the USGS, so they directly coincide with that. This slide will go a little bit deeper into thinking about the structure of the framework and the hierarchical nature of the structure, and here we're just showing one lake, Lake Michigan, with grid cells laid across the colored portions of the Great Lakes. And we've taken these grid cells and we've spatially delineated them into zones that capture some of the differences in the geophysical drivers of the geophysical drivers that would describe sort of different kinds of habitat zones, circulation and temperature, and how those major differences could be captured in these different zones. So the green zone on this is really the coastal terrestrial zone, and so we capture from the shoreline, which is ordinary high water mark, or the edge of any coastal wetlands 5 kilometers inland. So we capture that coastal land contributing to the coastal aquatic areas of the Great Lakes. The light blue is from that high water mark to about 30 meters depth. So we're using that, the depth as a surrogate for the sort of changes in mechanical energy and temperature that we see at 30 meters, which is the sort of the depth of the thermocline. And then the blue areas are greater than 30 meters depth, so the deeper waters past the thermocline. And then we capture those, so we recognize that in the coastal terrestrial and the coastal and nearshore zones, that those areas have a lot more diversity and habitat, and they're much more spatially fine scale and complex. So we reflect that in the grid cells, and those zones are at 30 meters. Then in the open water, where there's a little bit less variation, especially in the data that's available, the grid cells are a little bit larger there at 1.8 kilometer grid cells. Then these grid cells can then be, they're nested, so they can be accumulated for any kind of purpose in multiple scales. So if you wanted to look at a broader scale and look at the mean of the those cells in that particular kind of unit, then that allows us to be sort of a nested hierarchical multiple scale framework. I don't want to forget to talk about how we are then linked to the terrestrial part of of the watershed of the basin, because one of the things that the project has been focused on is thinking about how does what happens on the land influence what happens in the coastal areas and the nearshore areas of the Great Lakes, and then how do the offshore areas also influence that coastal area. So if you can see those gray lines, that's showing the outlines of the watersheds that we have developed for the Great Lakes. And then we look at the inputs from the watershed at the pour points, or where the rivers enter into the coastal areas of the Great Lakes. Then each one of these cells that you see here is then linked to spatial data. And we have this is showing our caricature or a cartoon here of the Esri geospatial database that we've developed, where each cell has a unique ID that's linked to sort of the spatial hierarchy in the framework. And then so this last little area that's outlined in red shows a unique ID for that cell that then is spatially located into its lake, into its subbasin, and into its actual location in the framework. And then the last number is either the 30 meter or the 1.8 grid cell size, and then that unique ID is then linked to all the data that's available at that location. We've also looked at sort of the higher level and thinking about a Great Lakes classification. We have developed some subbasins and the associated catchments for those subbasins, and we've talked to Great Lakes experts from each lake, as well as incorporated basins from other different programs, and we feel like we've been able to consolidate all of that input. We've looked at the circulation patterns within the Great Lakes and delineated subbasins that primarily reflect the summer and spring circulation patterns. We also have developed integrated catchments. We didn't actually expect to do this at the start of the project, but what we ended up realizing because one of our key things that we really wanted to do was to be able to link the watershed influences into the coastal and offshore areas of the Great Lakes. However, when we looked at the watershed data on the Canadian side and the US side, they had developed watershed based on really different spatial scales. And even within Canada, from the southern portion to the northern portion of the basin, they were also at different spatial scales. So we went in with a great working group from both the US and Canadian side of the basin to develop some integrated catchments so that they are harmonized in the same spatial scale across the basin. And then again, each one of these watersheds is linked to a pour point at where it enters into the Great Lakes. Talk a little bit now, a few more slides to just talk a little bit about the data that we have. And this is just sort of listing the number of, sort of a list of the variables that we have that include biological variables, administrative boundaries, hydrologic, topographic, bathymetry, landscape, mechanical energy, circulation, wave kind of energy, a lot of temperature and energy and other stressor data. And each one of these data layers has a metadata file that's in the federally, I forgot the name of that, but it's federally compliant form for the metadata. Talk a little bit about some of the data now. So we have a substrate layer. So we have substrate layers for each one of the lakes. And each one of the lakes has substrate in various different classes that they don't match for each one of the lakes. And so we went in and talking again to experts lake-wide, we came up with a small set of classifications that could be harmonized across the Great Lakes. So this includes the Great Lakes substrate layers, as well as the shoreline classifications, and as well as some much more fine scale substrate data that we've been able to find from different research projects around the Great Lakes. So I think this might be one of the most up-to-date harmonized substrate layers. We've also then I'm just showing you a couple examples of data where we've harmonized across the US and Canada, and we were able to get shoreline classifications from both the Canadian Shoreline Sensitivity Index as well as the Army Corps of Engineers Shoreline Classification, and harmonize these into about 7 categories that could be harmonized across those 2 classes. And we've been able to use this in better classifying the shoreline and being able to incorporate some of that, the differences in shoreline into our classification system. I have a couple of slides to show you about temperature. So we have quite a few different temperature variables. We have been able to use the NOAA Coast Watch satellite data to summarize surface water temperature for every day from, I can't remember the entire length of the time, but here we're showing it summarized from 2008 to 2012 for August. And then we also have, so then we're using that, we've used that surface water temperature to calculate a number of other variables that managers have told us have been really useful. And one of them is upwelling. And here we're showing an example of the upwelling index that we've been able to develop and calculate just for Lake Michigan. The 2 graphs on the left show the surface water temperature on one date, and on the furthest left, and then we've developed this automated program that looks at the surface water temperature and compares it to a threshold value from a median threshold value to then be able to identify areas where there is upwelling occurring. And then we've been able to summarize we used methods from Plattner et al. Where there's an algorithm that allows us to, we've been able to automate into our GIS program. And then we've been able to summarize those areas of upwelling over a year or over a season. But on the right, we're showing the upwelling index for 2010 just for Lake Michigan, where we show high areas of upwelling. So we can do this for any season for a number of series of years. We also have taken in there's a vertical part component to GLAHF, where each cell in the open water has from a top to the bottom we can characterize conditions, and this is showing an example of characterizing water temperature, and this is also from the NOAA's Great Lakes Coastal Forecasting System and their hydrodynamics model that looks at both circulation patterns and water temperature in regular bins from the top to the bottom of the Great Lakes. And Lacey has developed some programming that is able to capture those temperature and circulation, looking at it capturing it from the epilimnion and from the thermocline and from the hypolimnion. So then we can been able to summarize that for each day. And here we're looking at a summary of August over a 5-year period from 2006 to 2011. And here we're looking at it from the 0 to 20 meter depth, which might represent the epilimnion, to the 20 to 40 meter depth in the thermocline, and then from the greater the 40 meter depth in the hypolimnion. A couple more. We've taken, we've been able to use the bathymetry data that we have and calculate relief and depth, and come up with this figure we are calling lake Geo Forms, which are really a way for people to envision or visualize what does the lake bottom look like. And it ends up, I think, being a very incredibly interesting way to think about how is the lake structured, and where might fish passages be, and where are the reef structures located, and how might they relate to each other. We have just recently we've been able to add in two new variables thanks to some graduate students that we've been able to hire, really talented graduate students. So James Stack helped us work on this bathymetry, and one of the things that managers and researchers have told us consistently what data do they really want? They want fine scale bathymetry. And so on the left, you'll see the bathymetry that has been available, and that's from the NOAA bathymetry, and it's at sort of 10-meter intervals, which doesn't really capture much of the fine scale bathymetry variation in the coastal and near shore. And that's become available recently on the U.S. side from the Army Corps of Engineer LIDAR data. And so we were able to acquire that data. Some of it had been processed already by the NOAA Coastal Program. There was also gaps, so we acquired some of the Army Corps of Engineer LIDAR data and sonar data to develop a much more fine-scale bathymetry in the near shore, and we're showing that in these 1-meter increments on the right. So we are able to have much more fine-scale bathymetry. And we're going to show you a little bit example then of how we've been using that in GLAHF, looking at an area right near Pictured Rocks in Grand Island. And the location there is on the bottom left where that red square is. And so we, in GLAHF, we've been able to incorporate the digital elevation model as well as the relief. We calculate the relief and summarize the relief at the 30-meter grid cells. And at the end, we've divided the 30-meter grid cells into 10-meter grid cells and incorporated the relief as well there, looking to the future when we might be able to get finer and finer scale. We also have the 1-meter contours as a data layer, and then we've been able to calculate slope and rugosity at the 30-meter grid cell, so we can reflect that finer scale bathymetry within the framework. Another new variable that we've been able to do, Andrew Lehman, who is here in the audience, is a grad student who's been working on developing a fetch variable for us. And fetch is a variable that we have captured in circulation, we have captured in actual wave data, but many people are interested in looking at fetch as an indicator. So we wanted to try to see if we could come up with a really a fetch variable that incorporated wind direction and incorporated the wind velocity as well. So Andrew worked with data from the wind buoys, and here we're showing 2 wind buoys in Lake Michigan, and these are wind roses that we see on the left, where the little triangles are showing the wind speed in the colors, the frequency and the height or the size of the triangles, and then the direction is in the direction around the wind rose. So he's looked at, taking all the data that's there and divided up into 36 different directions and summarized it here in these wind rows. And then it's gone in and taken that data and developed our fetch variable, and there's sort of 3 different ways that you can think about summarizing a fetch variable. And the simplest way, and what's often been done, is just looking at distance. And so the one on the left is looking at just the distance of the fetch without really weighting it by the actual direction that the wind occurs.
We've got a question from the webinar.
Okay.
Have you considered using the FGDC endorsed Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard, CMECS, to classify your data?
I don't really, does that make, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't registering. We have worked with the CMEX group, and we have back in some of the earlier meetings that we have talking about classification, we have worked with them. They actually are taking a slightly different approach than we've been taking, where they are not, and we're thinking about the classification. Kevin is going to be talking about the classification, so that you might help understand that a little bit more, but we're actually using data to help us with our ecological classification, where CMEX is more looking at sort of a classification, looking at the different data layers and assigning a sort of a nomenclature to their classification. And so I think once we get a little bit further down on the classification that we've developed, we'd like to then get back and work with the CMEX group to see how can we integrate the classification we have with their nomenclature. And CMEX is actually quite interested in working with us because they have not developed the CMEX classification for the Great Lakes. So they're looking for us for help in that and to help guide them. So yes, we have been working with them. Thanks for helping out with that question. And so the one on the left was sort of just a straight wind length of the fetch. Then the second step would maybe be incorporate the frequency of that wind direction. That's what you're seeing in that middle graphic. And then you start to see some of the differences in fetch between the east and the west coast of Lake Michigan. And then finally, if you can also incorporate the wind velocity, and that's our final fetch variable, incorporates those three parts of the fetch, then you can really start to see some of the variation across the Great Lakes. And we've done this for all lakes. We're just showing you Lake Michigan here for simplicity. I think I'm coming up to my sort of final slide here, Kevin. And we've been able to incorporate some of the satellite imagery or the satellite derived variables from the Michigan Tech Resource Institute, MTRI. And here we're just showing the KD 490 or the turbidity related variable. We have also the chlorophyll A data that they've been able to develop, as well as the SAV data that we've been able to incorporate into our database. And now Kevin is going to take over.
All right, I'm going to talk about the GLAHF products. So in addition to what Catherine talked about, the GIS spatial data layers that are harmonized across the basin, and the framework, which consists of the spatial grids, the nearshore, the coastal, the nearshore, and the offshore zones, the watersheds we've delineated, and the subbasins. In addition to those, which are all our goals to make all of those publicly available, we have a number of other products. As Catherine said, we're developing this ecological classification where we're trying to capture and describe the major environmental gradients that exist across the Great Lakes. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. The idea with the classification is that that'll give us a way to summarize the kind of the universe of habitat types across the Great Lakes and give us a lexicon to start to talk about these different places, give us a context for interpreting sample data, providing a framework for monitoring, and also identify areas, basically identifying areas that are relatively homogeneous where we might expect organisms and other things to respond similarly to similar management practices. We're also working on a conditions assessment of coastal fish habitat. We have some funding from the Great Lakes Fish Habitat Partnership to characterize the condition of fish habitat in the nearshore area for use in prioritizing funding and management actions focused on restoration of fish habitat. And then finally, I'm going to talk about in a little more detail some of the web-based tools we're developing that will help us deliver this information to the public, to managers and researchers and policymakers, and to also aid in ecosystem-based management of the Great Lakes. So let's talk about the classification a little bit. So our very simple classification framework, and I will do my best to walk you through this. We developed classifications for each of our zones, which are kind of the lowest tier of dark blue boxes. So we have starting from the right, we have the offshore zone, the coastal nearshore, the coastal margin, coastal terrestrial, and so on. We constrained the classification within each of those zones, but we developed it for the entire Great Lakes. And what the upper upper boxes above that shows that we can scale that classification up and display it for subbasins or for Lake Michigan in this case, or for the entire Great Lakes. But it was constrained, it was developed for the entire Great Lakes, constrained within each of these zones. So let's continue with the offshore zone on the right-hand side of the screen. Let's go to the bottom. So we have our data attributed to our 1.8 kilometer grid cells in the offshore zone. Of all those data layers that Catherine talked about, we worked with a team to develop a suite or a short list of variables we felt were important drivers of the major chemical and physical and biological gradients in the Great Lakes. Listed there are just some examples, things like substrate, depth, we considered circulation and temperature. And there was a whole laundry list that we went through. Using those variables then, we broke those variables, each variable into bins. So in the case of temperature, let's say low, medium, and high. Substrate would be different classes of texture. And we did that to create ecological units. And those thresholds were based on literature information or from input from our advisory group. And then once we had each of those variables broken down into different categories, we overlaid those and together to create ecological units, and that will become more apparent here in just a second. But again, I want to emphasize that it was done for the entire lakes. All the lakes were considered at the same time, but it was constrained within each of these zones. So our final suite of variables for our existing prototype classification consisted of bathymetry, cumulative degree days, and mechanical energy. This shows the bathymetry classes that we created. These are the ecological types. So in the offshore, in the blue there, we have a shallow offshore area from 30 to 100 meters and a deep offshore area which is greater than 100 meters. In the nearshore, we divided that up into a shallow and deep area as well. The shallow we have a very shallow offshore area which goes from 15 to 30 meters in Lake Erie, and that was one tweak we made to this to account for the fact that much of Lake Erie is very shallow, even though you have these big offshore areas. The remaining nearshore areas were classed into shallow and deep. The shallow nearshore is 3 to 5 meters, and the deep nearshore is 5 to 30 meters in the Great Lakes, except for Lake Erie, it goes from 5 to 15 meters. And then we retained our coastal area, which is the very shallow, from 0 to 3 meters. Our cumulative degree days were based on a summary of the average daily water temperature from 0 to 20 meters above a base of 0. And we put a threshold for warm, dividing warm from everything else based on our work in inland lakes, where we see lake systems that are dominated by warm water fishes are separated from lake systems that are dominated by cool and cold water. We placed an additional break here separating cool and what we call cool and cold based on the prevalence of or dominance of cold stenotherms basically in Lake Superior and in northern Lake Huron. And finally, mechanical energy. For this variable, we broke it into low, medium, and high. And in the offshore areas, this was based on circulation magnitude. And in the nearshore areas, it was based on spring wave height. So we then overlay those three variables. And this is our prototype classification for the Great Lakes. It's a little fuzzy. We ended up with 49 aquatic ecological units across the Great Lakes, and there's roughly 22,000 patches. And in this you can see, so this is coded for the 3 variables. I'm not going to go through each of these, but if you'll notice Lake Superior is large, cold, and has low energy. No surprise, right? Relatively homogeneous. It has the fewest number of categories or ecological types. Lake Erie was also had a low number of ecological types. It's primarily shallow, high energy, mostly warm. But if you look at Lake Huron, it has sort of these elements that are similar, kind of intermediate between those 2 lakes, with Saginaw Bay being shallow and warm, and then the area out in the northern part of Lake Huron being very cold, deep, and low energy, very similar to the habitats we see in the open water of Lake Superior. Lakes Ontario and Michigan were relatively similar, having areas of cold upwelling on the northwest coast of Lake Michigan and northern coast of Lake Ontario. Now, as Catherine said, we are also very interested in trying to account for this influence of tributaries or the terrestrial inputs into the nearshore zone. And so we work to create what we call a tributary influence variable. This is a generic index, and it's based on watershed size. So we apply watershed size to the pore points of watersheds and allow that to decay out into the Great Lakes to the 30-meter contour. And it's weighted by watershed size. So Saginaw Bay shows a high tributary influence because the Saginaw River watershed is very large. So we have this for the pore points. We also have it for the interfluve watersheds. So those watersheds that don't have a large tributary that enters the Great Lakes, but a series of smaller tributaries. A different decay factor was applied to those and also allowed to progress out into the Great Lakes. So now we have some measure of how the level of influence of watersheds on the nearshore. So when we incorporate that back into our original classification, that is the same classification now modified to show tributary influence, and the yellow colors tend to show higher tributary influence, and the red areas in the nearshore show less tributary influence. So quite a lot of detail now in the nearshore by incorporating that variable. We're going to zoom in here to Lake Michigan, kind of the southern portion of the basin. And you can see in the middle there are 3 different classes. We have the deep offshore. All of these are, well, the 600 numbers, the 6,000 numbers are the deep offshore with cool and low energy and cool and moderate energy. And also then the lighter blue there is the shallow offshore, cool with moderate energy. Looking to the left there, we could see deep nearshore areas that are cold, that have medium and small and minimal tributary influence. Very little area having high tributary influence on that west side of Lake Michigan. When you look on the east coast of Lake Michigan, though, you can see that band of purple. That's an area of shallow nearshore area that has high tributary influence. And then moving offshore into the deep nearshore area. In contrast to the west coast, the east coast is cool, and there you can see the small and minimal influence of tributaries. So this gives us a way to start to think about and characterize different ecological types, different areas that might be functioning in a very similar fashion, and characterizing these differences and similarities across the Great Lakes. Yes?
Question from the remote audience. Did you also consider actual flow estimates from known gauges in addition to watershed area for the tributary influence variable?
No, we did not. The gauge data is pretty sparse, and this gives us a consistent way to have an index of tributary influence for all catchments throughout the Great Lakes Basin. I'm going to move to decision support tools, and we're interested in serving the information to people, but also trying to provide some tools that will help with ecosystem-based management of the Great Lakes. And what we've learned that decision support tools are often not used by practitioners because there's a gap between developers and practitioners. And this is based on the literature, and it's also based on a literature review that our project team conducted of existing decision support tools. And so what we've done is enlisted the help of Rob Goodspeed. He's a professor in the School of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. And we've incorporated a participatory process for developing decision support tools. So we've held a couple of workshops, one on the US side, one in Canada, brought together researchers and managers and asked them what are their information needs and what kind of tools would they need to make better decisions. And we actually put them to work. We put them into groups. We had them actually design what a tool would look like, sketch out on these big pieces of paper what kind of data layers do they want to see in a tool, what kind of graphics, what would the buttons look like, and what kind of decisions would they help you make. Then we took all of those. There were a number of projects proposed in each of the workshops, and we synthesized all that and did some voting and ended up with two final tools that we are now working on. And one is there was great interest in developing a decision support tool using the GLAHF information that would enable managers to identify areas of habitat suitability across the Great Lakes for different species of fish. And the second one was a tool that would allow managers to do better coastal management and planning. So we've been hard at work developing these tools, and this is just an example of our data viewer that allows people to access the information that we have in the GLAHF database. It has a display function, it has query functions, and we're using this as sort of the backbone to overlay these different decision support tools. And I'll give you just an example here of a progress we've made on developing the habitat suitability mapper. And what we envision is being able to incorporate existing models of habitat suitability that have been published, but also allow the user to input different variables and criteria to identify parts of the lake that might be suitable, parts of the Great Lakes that might be suitable for any other kind of purpose that they might have. And this just shows a habitat suitability map in Lake Erie for walleye based on a model published by Pandit et al. With the dark blue area showing the habitats that are suitable for walleye based on temperature, chlorophyll, and temperature and depth and Secchi depth. We're working on a website that will be the portal for accessing all this information. It'll include background information about the GLAHF project, the framework itself, the data, watersheds, the classification, our coastal assessment, and other things. It should be, hopefully will be one-stop shopping. We have currently a number of projects and partners that have been using the GLAHF products we've developed to date, including the watersheds, the data, the framework itself. And we hope to continue to have many other people use this information. Again, the goal is to make it publicly available and accessible. So just to sum up, what is GLAHF? So it's a spatial classification framework. It includes the grids, the watersheds, the subbasins. It's a comprehensive GIS database of georeferenced data that's harmonized across the U.S. and Canada. It includes the Great Lakes coastal, large river mouth, and open water habitats, with a focus on the nearshore and accounting for the terrestrial inputs to the nearshore area. And I'd like to acknowledge our funding and support, especially the Great Lakes Fishery Trust for funding the GLAHF project. We've gotten funding from the University of Michigan Water Center and the Herb Foundation to develop our decision support tools. We've got funding from the Great Lakes Fish Habitat Partnership to conduct the fish habitat assessment in the nearshore area, and the Michigan DNR for long-term support of GLAHF and tool development. And we also like to thank all of our collaborators and advisors that have provided input all along throughout the GLAHF project.
Thank you very much, and we have some time for questions.
Yeah, it's an announcement and then a question. The announcement was I was supposed to say beforehand that whoever wants to go out to lunch with Kevin and Catherine, we're going to go out after this seminar is over to El Zarape. It's a Mexican joint at the end of State Road where it hits US 12 in the shopping center across. And so that's the announcement. I heard they were buying, but so a lot of NOAA data went into this thing, and to make it a living tool, we need to keep incorporating data on winds and waves and surface temperature and chlorophyll, et cetera, et cetera. What's the plan for that?
I can start to address that, but I think maybe Kevin can do a really great job of helping with that, because the IFR has taken on the financial responsibility for hosting GLAHF and the decision support tools and has signed a staff person to that. However, we are sort of trying to look at broadening that support, looking at other federal and binational agencies so that there is I think that we need more support to try to pull in more data, to try to pull in, develop more tools and make this more useful. So we have ongoing maintenance, but expansion is where we're looking for other buy-in from other federal agencies. Did you want to say any more about that?
I think that's
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah, we're looking forward, developing diverse partnerships to not only get additional data, but to keep it relevant to the broad base of researchers and managers across the basin.
Okay, we've got 4 or 5 questions online. I'm going to read those off in order. Has any work been done, or are there plans to do riparian delineation in the basins?
Not really. We're not really extending up into the rivers. We have an interest in the river mouths, but there is actually very little data that is consistent across the basin. There are data for river mouths in a few places. So again, that I think is something for the future where we start to incorporate projects that are more locally specific, and then we can work with them and maybe expand that data, apply that data across the basin. But for the beginning stages of this project, for the first 4 years of development, we were looking for data that was available across all the regions, and especially in river mouths, it's an area of real research interest, or research interest of mine, and a research interest of a lot of groups, but not very much data has been collected there. So we're not really going into the riparian areas of rivers, if that's what they're speaking
yeah, I didn't
of.
know. They meant riparian areas of the shoreline of the Great Lakes. or rivers.
Next question from remote audience. Why are there no data sets or classifications for Lake St. Clair?
That's yours.
We do have a classification for Lake St. Clair, and we do have data for Lake St. Clair, and I'm sorry if that didn't come out, although often we do ignore Lake St. Clair, I think, but we haven't. We have good bathymetry, we have circulation data for there, we actually have some really good SAV data for Lake St. Clair. So there is not as much data collected there in many ways, although they're for the Huron-Erie Corridor project, I can't remember, they call themselves a different name now, but so we do have some really fine scale data for there that we've been able to summarize as well. So it is included in our classification. We do have data for it. So,
are the tools and data viewer publicly available now?
The Spatial Framework is shareable and it's ready to be shared. We have been sharing it with different groups. You would need to contact us. The website is in prototype form. It's not quite active. We think that it will be active in August sometime, where you'll be able to go in and download that package, plus some database packages with README files and metadata. So yes, you can obtain the framework and some of the data from us, but for right now you need to contact us. But soon the database will be available and you'll be able to access that.
Okay, what I'm going to do is take the next 3 online questions and then go back to the local audience and give them a chance. So could the presenters expand on the database functionality of the GLAHF beyond the storage of the data in GIS layers?
Well, I'm not entirely sure about how to answer that, but and maybe I didn't make this quite clear, but for a number of the data layers, we've gone sort of beyond what the actual data layer is and been able to summarize those at different temporal and spatial extents so that people can use those to think about how the variation occurs spatially and temporally. We've also taken some of the data layers and been able to calculate new variables that researchers and managers have asked for instance, the upwelling. We've also done a spring rate of warming variable. So we have created new variables. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question.
Yeah, and in addition, so we're using those data layers to develop the classification and to do the assessment of nearshore fish habitat condition, and to develop these web-based tools such as habitat suitability mapping and conservation, shoreline conservation planning. It's being used to develop indicators for the water.
Well, we think that it's being used right now by a group up in Duluth, and they are going to be able to use the framework to spatially characterize the SOLEC indicators. So there's a lot of potential uses down the road.
Okay, can the programming for calculating upwelling be applied to the other lakes?
Yes, and it has been. In a number of cases, we've just shown Lake Michigan, in part because GLERL is very interested in Lake Michigan, and there is a Lake Michigan combined coordinated science and monitoring initiative happening right now. So we wanted to focus a little bit on Lake Michigan because of the interest within this group. But for all of the variables that we've shown, they have been calculated for all the lakes and basin-wide.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions from the room.
Yes.
So thank you guys, great presentation. I'm particularly interested in data sets that require year-round offshore data. So for example, when you show your wind speed data, that data set and other data sets require in situ monitoring or infrastructure that's often pulled out on a seasonal basis. So I guess my question is, to what extent does missing data in some of these seasonal humps represent gaps in the databases that you're trying to form, and would additional data in these quote-unquote off-season provide any benefit from a habitat perspective?
I'm not sure if I totally understand.
Do you need data in the wintertime?
Oh. Oh. Um, well, you know, we do have data in the wintertime, and I took out a few slides. One of them, we have ice cover data. We've been able to summarize that over time, and we've been able to do some analysis of that, and we've actually been working with you, Drew, on analyzing some of that ice cover data, as well as a number of other people here in the audience. And so we do have some of the winter data, and I just I took that out due to time, but so we do have that. Is that?
And we would welcome.
Okay, ice covered data, concentration, right? Not type.
Right, we have concentration data from your ice atlas.
So very soon you should have type as well.
Well, that's very, very exciting, and I think Lacey and Drew and I will be very excited about incorporating that. That's really good news.
Also, as far as the winds, high resolution SAR, satellite SAR winds are being produced now for the Great Lakes, you know, winter and summer. So there'll be the wind data is available as well.
So George, it's a really good point, because I think as time goes on, the data that's going to be getting generated is just going to become better resolution and more of it, and so that's a reason for sort of having this long-term support and management of GLAHF, so we can develop the methodologies to incorporate that data as well. So that's really exciting news.
I really loved the fish habitat aspect of your tools that you're developing, and I was wondering if you had incorporated life history into those sort of habitat blobs, so it kind of follows the fish as they migrate from one side of the lake to the other, or considers how different conditions might affect their suitability at different types of year or different times of year.
I think so in that paper, there's not a lot of actually published habitat suitability index models for the Great Lakes, and I think Ed would like to speak to this. But so in that particular paper, they showed habitat suitability for walleye juveniles, adults, and then overall walleye model. And we're showing there the overall walleye model with the most limited model. They had several models, and so we're actually showing the worst model in the paper, because that's the only data that we had. We have now just recently required much finer scale chemistry data, so we think we're going to be able to develop a better model using that. So yes, they have looked at different life stages, and yes, I think we can produce a better model for that into the future, because somebody wasn't very happy with it.
Yeah, it sucked. But Lacey Mason has actually been working on distribution models for salmonids in the Great Lakes, and trying to incorporate those data in GLAHF to look at where they go and why they're going where they're going. And the nice thing about this is that you be able to, do your own model distribution and movement model, pulling down environmental variables. That was one of the things that came out of the workshop. So I actually wanted to ask you another question. So we're involved in a lot of coordinated sampling of the Great Lakes, and each Great Lake gets sampled intensively once every 5 years. This is the year of Lake Michigan, as you mentioned, the CSMI. So one of the big issues is trying to get everybody on the same page. Where are you going to sample to address what question? And so having this in advance, having people understand it and use it to plan out their sampling, as well as serve as a framework for their data that they're collecting, would be tremendous. So I think next year is superior.
Superior.
Yeah. But getting it sort of in front of people well before that would be huge, I think.
Yeah, and so I think that the folks up in NRI and University of Minnesota, Duluth, and Tom Hollenhorst at the EPA up in Lake Superior, they have the framework now, and they're working with it. They're sort of some of our first round of beta testers to make sure that any questions that we haven't answered about how to use the framework and how it links to the data. So I'm hoping that then that will facilitate using it for that, and I regret that it wasn't quite available for the Lake Michigan CSMI, because I think it would be really helpful for people to be able to look at where is monitoring underrepresented, where has data been collected in the past, and so that was a great comment. Thank you, Ed.
So we've got a lot more questions online. So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to encourage for the remote audience, thank you for your patience, and you can always email Catherine too at criseng, CRISENG at umich.edu.
Right.
But we'll try to get to everyone, but just so that you know. So next online question, when will the web-based tool be available publicly?
It should be available this fall. We've developed sort of a wireframe prototype that we've shared, and we are now working on integrating some of the tools for the website with the data, and it ends up being a fairly complicated, even more complicated than we thought, because the data is so dense that it becomes hard to really serve on the web. So just recently we sent out some of our GIS analysts and web-based programmers out to an Esri conference, and we're hoping to get some of their newest techniques for being able to summarize that data. So we're really close to sending out a beta version to our beta testers, and we hope to have it available later in the fall.
There's a question here, will the webinar be posted? Yes, it will. I think it's going to take us until Monday, but you can email me separately. We'll be posting it on the GLERL YouTube site and also probably the Siler website, I'm assuming. I think that will happen on Monday. I've got a follow-up question. I can't remember what the front end of it was. Will you be publishing map services in August or sometime soon? Mina Eins, if you could clarify, I think this was a follow-up to an earlier question, if you could chat that to me. In the meantime, another question, how is data stored beyond a standard file server? Database implies specialized storage beyond standard file storage.
You know, that's a technical question that I was wondering if Lacey, would you feel comfortable answering that? Or I don't want to put you on the spot.
Right, so database inherently just means a data storage system, which is kind of how we refer to this. A lot of our data, anything that's in GIS format, is available in what Esri produces as their Geo database. It's a proprietary format that's kind of the standard for GIS data. But also a lot of our data comes as point files or sampling files. It's tabular, so we store our source data in its original format, and then we also convert it in and bring it into file geo databases by variable type. And we will probably be serving up data in geo database format, but we'll be happy to get feedback from people if ASCII files, shape files, or something more open source would be a better way to serve up our data. So if you have any feedback, please send it to Catherine.
And Lacey.
Catherine, thank you, and Kevin, for a really nice presentation. I've seen some of the nuts and bolts of pulling together data layers and pulling out your hair sometime, but it's really cool to see the final products of this in terms of the habitat suitability mapping and some of the tools that are coming out of it. Have you considered moving that suitability mapping to things beyond fish? And I know you said it was going to be open where people can put in their own things, but it occurs to me that things like submerged aquatic vegetation, cladophora growth, other lower in the trophic web things would be also very appropriate for that sort of mapping.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And basically it's a simple process. So any published habitat suitability model can be incorporated and hung off of this framework. The limitation, though, often is the models are developed with a different set of data, and we have to use surrogates, large-scale course-level surrogates to do that. But certainly we can do that, and I think we'll look into doing that in the near future. So I was going to go back to your comment about Ed had suggested that you can take these data and develop your own life history specific habitat suitability models. And once you have those developed, you can put them back into GLAHF and then make those viewable by the public. So.
And in some ways, I think this first set of models, we're basically working out all the nuts and bolts of how to create its tool and how to summarize the data and how to serve up the data. And so I think we are looking for what is the next generation of tools, and we're really happy to get your input and work with you on that. That would be great.
Okay, I think what we're going to do is take 2 more questions online and then wrap it up. Just for everyone's information, we've had 52 remote participants today, and I'd just like to put in a plug for some more feedback on our technology. We're dedicated to doing better webinar service, and I know that we had some early glitches with an echo, so if you could chat us or email me offline, we would, of course, like to deliver the best webinar possible. Here we go. We were wondering if you will publish these data via WMS/webmap services from your site so that we could automatically ingest the data through our state portal.
Yes.
But
We're using REST services. Authoritatively, we're using REST services, but whatever those services mean, that yes, you will be able to to download that data and be able to use it on your website, and be able to also download the framework and link that data to the framework if that's how you want to use it, which we hope it is.
Okay, and we'll make this our last question for today. How will the aquatic ecological units be ground truthed/verified?
Okay, so that's like the best question yet, because that is a really big challenge. Because one of the things that we realized is that there really, if we are thinking about it in terms of habitat, there really are no biological data that have been collected consistently across the Great Lakes in all kinds of habitat from the coastal areas out to the open water. I mean, there is benthos data, but mostly it's collected on only soft substrate. So there's not really data that's available. So what we are doing is trying to look at taking our classification units and looking how does that relate to some of the other physical and chemical data that we have, and does it adequately, or does it show differentiation in those other kind of variables that help us validate that these are our units are valid units. And then we'll be bringing all of that analysis back. We have a habitat classification working group that are a group of experts that are really focused on this area and will provide really great input, so we can then share what we have, share our analysis, and get their input and feedback. So that's the process that we're moving along. Did you have anything else to add to that?
Terrific. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Laurel Seiler Seminar Series, Catherine and Kevin, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.